Hello, friends. So, in this week's lecture, we're taking a look at issues concerning the relationship between free will and responsibility. Now, let's set this in the context of the wider context of the course. So, like I said, throughout this course, we've been focusing on a few elements of the package deal, right? So, the package deal, or the package view, has been a view that we get out of Plato and Descartes. That view holds that human beings have disembodied minds, that we are rational, that we are free, and that we are asocial/agendered. Right? So far we've seen challenges to the disembodied mind part. Right? We saw that with Ryle, we saw that with Strawson, Peter Strawson, we saw that with Churchland. We've also come across objections to the rational part. Right? So we saw that with Churchland and also with Hume. We've also seen objections to the free part, right? We saw that Spinoza thinks that we aren't free. We've seen that Hume thinks that we are both free and determined. So, and I know I'm forgetting some philosophers in there, so my apologies. So what we're looking at this week is we're looking at specifically the issue about the relationship between free will and responsibility. Now, strictly speaking, this isn't part of the package deal as we've talked about it. So why include it? Well, I include it because I think there's this intuition that we are responsible only for those actions that are performed freely, right? So if you didn't perform an action freely, then you're not responsible for it. So in other words, responsibility is coextensive with freedom. We are responsible for all and only those actions that we perform freely. So I think there's something of an intuition behind this, I think it's kind of a gut feeling we have about freedom and responsibility. And I think using various thought experiments, we can flesh out this intuition. But I'm just going to take the intuition as given, rather than try to flesh it out through thought experiments, because again, it seems pretty straightforward. So what we're going to look at this week is we're going to take a look at philosophers who want to challenge that idea of the coextensive character of freedom and responsibility, or at least challenge our pre-theoretical or our intuitive ideas about what it means to be responsible, or those things for which we are responsible. So, what we find today is a pair of philosophers, Galen Strawson, so Peter Strawson's son, Galen Strawson, arguing that we aren't responsible, or what he calls ultimately morally responsible for any of our actions. And we find a rebuttal by a philosopher, Susan Wolf. So what we're going to do in this clip is we're going to talk about different varieties of freedom, and then we'll talk about Galen Strawson's position, and then in the next clip we'll talk about Susan Wolf's response to Galen Strawson. Okay, so first, ideas about freedom. So far, we've been working with freedom to do certain kinds of things, right? So think about Hume as our paradigm case, right? Hume says you're free as long as you're not compelled, right? As long as there's no gun to the head, scenarios like that. And as long as you feel free while you're doing it, right? So that is, you do what you do because of your will, and you're not compelled and you're coerced into doing whatever it is that you're doing. Right? That's all it is to be free. Now, in the philosophical literature, or in discussions of free will, that's often described as freedom of action. So again, freedom of action. So what do we mean by freedom of action? Well, what we mean here is basically that you're free to do whatever it is that you want to do. Now, freedom of action is contrasted with another kind of freedom, right? So it's not just, so this other kind of freedom isn't just being able to do what you want to do. It's being able to become a certain kind of a person, right? That is, to choose the kind of will you want to have. So it's not just being able to choose something. It's being able to choose the kind of person you are to become. So this is called freedom of will. So freedom of action is doing, having the freedom to do whatever it is you want to do. Freedom of will is having the freedom to become whomever you wish to be. So some philosophers think that we have freedom of action, but not freedom of will. So for example, Hume is a guy who would think that we have freedom of action, but not freedom of will. Along with somebody like Strawson, right? Peter Strawson is going to be another guy who would focus on freedom of action versus freedom of will. Although even that's a little bit because he focuses on reactive attitudes more than anything else. So Dan Dennett. So Dennett, we've seen Dennett a bit. So he focuses on freedom of action rather than freedom of will. So who focuses on freedom of will? Well, in a sense, Descartes focuses on freedom of will. So does Chisholm. So freedom of will is what we might describe as a deeper sort of freedom, right? It's not just being able to choose whatever it is you want to do, but it's about being whoever you want to become. Now, what we find Galen Strawson talking about is he seems to be focused on freedom of action as opposed to freedom of will. So he introduces this notion of ultimate moral responsibility. So what do we mean by ultimate moral responsibility? Well, he says, imagine the kind of responsibility we need to make sense of eternal salvation or eternal damnation. So that idea of responsibility is like the choice, the causes of your actions all stop with you. So, in other words, if there is any way that you can pass on the buck, wherever the grammar is there, for some action, if you're able to pass along that buck, then you are not ultimately morally responsible for your actions. So, right, imagine this. Imagine that my salvation or my damnation hinged on taking a sip of water here, right? Suppose that I'll be damned if I take a sip of water. And imagine I just suddenly die, right? And I'm up there and I'm at the pearly gates, right? And St. Peter says to me, "Look, man, you took that sip of water, right? Bad news for you, friend." And I say, whoa, man, right? It's not my fault. I was ridiculously thirsty when I took that sip of water, right? So really, I couldn't have not had that sip of water, right? I was so thirsty that I had to drink that sip of water. Not my fault. Well, as long as I can provide a compelling enough reason that it's not my fault for drinking the water, right? That I had to have that sip of water, even though I did it. Well, then it would seem reasonable that St. Peter wouldn't, send me on the slow boat to hell, right? Why? Because really, I'm not the one who's ultimately responsible for the water drinking, right? It's the fact that I was incredibly thirsty, right? The fact that I needed water, right? That's what caused me to drink the water. So I'm not ultimately morally responsible for drinking the water, right? I drink the water because I have a biological need to drink the water. So, the idea with ultimate moral responsibility is that you are ultimately morally responsible for an action, provided that, or just in those cases, that you are unable to pass the buck along anymore for why you performed the action. So, the question that comes up for us is, are there any such actions? So in other words, are there any actions where the buck stops with you? You can't pass it along any further. Galen Strawson's argument is that there are no such actions. Right? There are no actions where you are unable to pass the buck along further down the line for why you did it. How do we get there? Well, we begin by reflecting that we make the choices that we make because of the characters that we have. So in other words, our actions flow from our character. Right? So you do what you do because of who you are. Fair enough? So the question is what makes you who you are? Well, you are who you are today because of past choices that you made. Right? So your personality, your character right now, is a product of previous choices you've made. And so, for example, you are currently enrolled in a university philosophy course because of previous choices you made. Right? So you are a university student because of your prior choices. Perhaps you are generous because of prior choices you made. Or perhaps you tend to be honest because of prior choices you made. Right? But you are who you are today because of choices you made previously. Fair enough. So we move things back a step. Right? Why did you make those choices as opposed to other choices? Well, those choices you made previously, you made those earlier choices because of who you were then. Right? So your previous choices flowed out of your previous state of character. So, next question is obviously, well, what gave you that character? And so you have that previous character because of choices you made even earlier in your life. So you see how the argument's going, right? You make the choices you make because of who you are at a certain point in time. Who you are at a certain point in time is a product of previous choices you made. So, what happens? Well, we keep doing this backward step, right? Where you make choices because of who you are as a result of previous choices. The previous choices you made are a result of who you were previously is a result of previous choices you made, right? We keep doing this back and back until we get to a point in which the choices you make, in which the character you have could not possibly be the product of choices you make. How do we get there? Well, every one of us is born with a certain biological disposition, right, with a certain set of genes. We don't have any responsibility. We have no control over the genes we're given. Each one of us is born into a specific social circumstance. No one of us has any control over the family into which we're born. So, the two most powerful influencers on our early character are biology and our social circumstances. We don't have control over either of those things. But those things are responsible for giving us our character, our initial character states, which produce the choices we make, which produces a further character, which results in further choices, which results in a further character, which, going through back up the line, brings us to now. So, again, just to think about it, right? Sort of, we can run the argument, starting from our early stages and coming up to now, right? So, what we just did, we started with the now and we worked our way back, right? So now let's start at the beginning and work our way forwards to see the same point, but just maybe different direction. We are born as babies. When we're born as babies, we're born with a set of genes, right? With a certain biology. We have no control over any of that. You get the genes you get, that's it. Right? You have no say in that. Furthermore, as a baby, you are born into a specific set of social circumstances. Again, you have no say in that, right? You don't get a choice in who your parents are, in who your relatives are, who your family friends are, who where you're living, the language you speak. You get a choice in none of that. So, the two things that are most powerful in shaping your early character, your biology, your social upbringing, you have no control over any of those. Those things combined will produce some state of character for you. From that state of character, you make choices. Right? And once we get that far, right, you get a character that results in choices. Well, those choices produce the character that you have. Right? And so, right, you have a character which makes choices, which reinforces or helps establish a character that you have, which in turn results in other choices, which in turn establishes a certain character that you have, which produces other choices. Continue that cycle all the way up till now. And you'll see that because we had no control over the initial states, that lack of control works its way all the way up the line until now. So, the question is there a point at which the buck stops for responsibility for action? Right? Or rather, more precisely, the better way of putting the question is, does responsibility for my action, does the buck for that ever stop with me? And the answer is no. Because if we ask why I made this choice, well, I made this choice because of who I am. Why am I this way? Because of previous choices I made. Continue that all the way back until we get to the state of character that I had when I first started making choices autonomously. Well, how did I get that character? Well, I got it from the biology that I inherited and from my social circumstances, my social upbringing. I don't have control over either of those things. So, I have the character, my initial character states were the product of forces completely beyond my control. So, when I'm at the pearly gates, and St. Peter says to me, why did you drink the water? I can pass that buck right on to facts about my biology, and on to facts about my social upbringing. So, I can always pass the buck of responsibility on to somebody other than me, or some state of affairs that made me who I am. So, in response to the question, am I ever ultimately morally responsible for my actions? The answer for Galen Strawson is no. Right? I can't be ultimately morally responsible for my actions because I'm not responsible for the way that I am. So, if you want the argument in a nice modus tollens, it would look like this. If I'm ultimately morally responsible for my actions, then I'm responsible for who I am. However, I'm not responsible for who I am. Therefore, I'm not ultimately morally responsible for my actions. So where does this leave us? Does it mean that we have no responsibility whatsoever? Not necessarily. Because Strawson makes it clear, Galen Strawson makes it clear, that ultimate moral responsibility is distinct from our ordinary everyday sense of responsibility. Right? So I might be everyday responsible for drinking the water, but I'm not ultimately morally responsible for drinking the water. Okay? So that's one. And second, I just want to highlight a point about Strawson's argumentative strategy here, which is to say he's using sort of this odd mix of empirical data and of sort of a thought experiment, right? So he's, it's kind of clear, it seems obvious what we know from genetics and what we know from social psychology, that we are the way we are because of biological forces and because of our upbringing, right? The so-called nature-nurture divide in psychology, which I think is not a terrible way. Anyway, the philosophy of psychology stuff is inside right now. So we have these two forces, right? You have the internal biology stuff, you've got the external social stuff, right? So, in a way, he's kind of running like a sort of experimental philosophy argument, but at the same time, relying on intuitive ideas about how the biology and how the social stuff interact. So, one thing I just want to highlight here is that it's like Strawson is appealing to something like a thought experiment, but at the same time, it's a thought experiment informed by our scientific findings. And so, one might ask, what kind of evidence would it take to show that Strawson is wrong, right? Would scientific findings about the interactions between gene and culture show that he's wrong? Or would a further thought experiment show that Strawson is wrong? So the reason I want to highlight this is to just, well, first of all, highlight the point about Strawson's argument and his methodology, but also to illustrate something of a meta point about philosophical methodology, which is that when we first started this course, we had very clean dividing lines between types of philosophical methods. But once you get down in the trenches and once you're doing philosophy, then those lines become a bit blurred, right? And in blurring those lines, on the one hand, we get a lot of argumentative power, but on the other hand, it becomes unclear just what it takes to support or refute some particular argument. So, in the next clip, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about Susan Wolf's response to Galen Strawson's position that we are not ultimately morally responsible for